Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's discussion. I am Aretha Lafayette, Program Manager for Research Education Program Development and Outreach in the Office of Research and Innovation. I will serve as the session MC for today's discussion. Before we begin this program, we would like to make a land acknowledgement. UT Dallas stands on land originally settled and occupied by the Caddo, Wichita, and Comanche people. We recognize the legacy of colonization and the harm caused by the forced removal of indigenous people from these lands. UT Dallas continues to benefit from the contributions of indigenous students and employees on our campus, and we are committed to ongoing support for the Native culture that is essential to our community. For more information on the history of the land UT Dallas occupies, the Caddo Confederacy, and relevant treaties, please visit the Multicultural Center website. Today's webinar presentation explores funder motivations to help investigators target research and programmatic proposals effectively and subsequently develop proposals that put purpose before dollars. Attendees, led by a Hanover Grants Consultant, will study best practices for developing and communicating viable project ideas, focusing on alignment, integration, and evidence. This training will advance investigators' ability to identify appropriate funding sources and programs, improve investigators' persuasive writing, instruct investigators on methods to represent the association of theory and activity, and leave investigators with a clear sense of the elements that separate a good idea from a fundable concept. Joining us once again to offer this period of instruction is Paul Tuttle. Paul began his career in research administration in 2001 as a funding opportunities specialist. Since then, he has focused on pre-award and proposal development, managing those functions at 3 UNC system institutions. Later, at a for-profit grant writing company, he hired and supervised what became a team of 16 grant consultants, serving nearly 500 United States clients in 4 sectors: higher education, K-12, nonprofits, and healthcare providers. After returning to North Carolina A&T State University, the nation's largest HBCU, to serve as the Director of Proposal Development February 2015 to January 2022, he has returned to Hanover Research as a grants consultant. Paul holds a Master's of Arts in English with a concentration in rhetoric and composition. His persuasive writing background has enabled him to assist faculty researchers and senior university administrators in securing over $175 million in sponsored program and research awards over the last 2 decades. He has participated in the National Council of University Research Administrators since 2001, the Society of Research Administrations International since 2003, and the National Organization of Research Development Professionals since 2012. He was the 2018-2019 president of SRIA's North Carolina chapter and was a 2018 through 2022 member of NORDP's board of directors. He continues to be an invited presenter at statewide, regional, national, and international conferences in research administration and research development. Paul, thank you once again for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Aretha. I would like to share my screen now. This is a presentation on the essentials of competitive proposals. I am quite happy with you interrupting me during the presentation if needed, but more likely the UT Dallas folks would be happy with you putting your questions in the chat, because Aretha will be emceeing and will be picking up on those either in the moment or at the end when we will have time for questions. So here we go. This wheel is how grants work. Look at the top. Starts with a great idea. You then find funders to fit your idea, not the other way around. You build a concept. You write it down. So it's not the same thing as a tree that fell in the forest and didn't make a sound. You actually write it down so it actually exists. Then you engage a program officer trying to find out how and how much, how best your concept actually fits the funding opportunity. Then there's the question of completing the actual proposal process, the formal application process. Then presumably, at least part of the time, you would receive an award. You would then do the work, and then you would prepare for future funding. We are at the orange step called the formal application process, and it's all about optimizing this part of the process so that your proposal, your application can in fact be competitive. So we'll talk today about your primary goal. We'll also talk about how to get organized, how to get ready to achieve that primary goal of making it a competitive proposal. We'll talk about writing in general and how most other academic writing differs considerably from grant writing. We'll talk about seeking feedback ahead of time before you actually submit the proposal through your university's sponsored programs and research office. And then we'll talk about elements of the grant narrative and how to make those elements more persuasive, more compelling, and thereby more competitive. And a little bit about some resources that you can leverage. And then finally, we'll have Q&A again, moderated by Aretha. So what is your primary goal? Your goal is, if you look on the left, in each part of the proposal, you want to raise reviewer confidence that you've thought through every aspect of your project design. You're presenting yourself as an expert or as someone who's at least on the leading edge of the trends in your field. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But mainly, you're going to be trying to convince the reviewers that you have a project that is ambitious but feasible. The U.S. Department of Education phrase is ambitious but attainable, but we also say feasible, that it's urgently needed. Please give me the money now, without saying it outright. And then finally, aligned with the intent of the opportunity or the competition. So to begin, you would need to prepare. You would need to read all the materials, backward, forward, in Swahili, whatever. Read them. Read the solicitation itself, and read anything that looks like a grant manual, like NSF's PAPPG, NIH's SF424 guide, anything in Department of Defense that says how we do business, anything in NASA that says this is how to write grants to NASA. Read the solicitation and all references to the grants manual. Go ahead and look for those things. No, you don't have to read all 250 pages of the grants manual at once, but you do need to be familiar with that organization's, that agency's culture and way of doing business, the way it reviews, the way it awards, so on and so forth, what it expects, all of that. Make a checklist then of all the required application elements and think about the proposal development aspect of this as its own project. You're going to be proposing a project, but you're also going to be doing a project while you're proposing. So the proposal development process is actually its own project. You're going to be noting required timelines and deadlines in the proposal development sequence. You're going to be creating a proposal development plan, including that timeline internally for you and for anyone who's helping you. And you'd want to create a narrative outline, a template or a skeleton, so that you can put information onto that skeleton like flesh and clothes. You would gather that information and make sure that you had all that you needed, including remembering that you are, as always, standing upon the shoulders of giants. You came into the world after many of the founding people in your field, and you will leave this world before the next generation takes over. We all have that situation. So you have to remember that you have to contextualize what you're trying to do. Now, this doesn't mean It really doesn't mean that you have to say, back at the dawn of time, there was a big bang, and everything after that I'm going to describe to you in 15 pages. No. What you need to do is you need to explore where you are in your context right now, go back a few years and say, here's what the field has developed into, here's what the wave looks like now, here's where we are on the leading edge of this trend, and here's how we got here, and here's a gap in knowledge that I see, because you need to remember that as a PhD, a person with that terminal degree in your field, as a PhD, you have been certified to create new knowledge as an investigator and give back to your field. And in fact, you're even obliged to do so by your being a tenured or tenure track faculty member, by your being a researcher in your field. You're obliged to do so, to add, to give back, to enhance the knowledge base. So when you gather that required information, you need to remember that this is just like the time when you did your dissertation. You described a gap in the field, and you talked about what you would do in order to fill or partly fill it. And so as a result, this is just yet another project, yet another investigation, but it needs to be explained very well according to an organized process, such as this one that I'm showing you here. So after you review all the grantmaker guidance, you would want to think about your project design. What are the funder's aims, and how does your project accomplish those aims? Asking these questions here because it's not all about you. Let me repeat that. It is not all about you. You are not reaching your hands out and cupping them and saying, please, I need the money. That is not your role. Your role is instead to take one hand and reach out for a handshake. You're going to be aligning with the funder. You're going to be looking at their mission and vision and saying to them, our aims coincide. I have certain goals of my own, and you have certain things that you want to do in the world. Our aims coincide. If you fund my project, which is aligned with your goals and what you want to do in the world, if you fund my project, I'll be happy to do it and give you the reports and publish it in the literature and present it at scholarly conferences and other dissemination venues, thus adding to the knowledge base in the field, which is also part of your purpose, Funder X. So think of it as a handshake, not two hands out asking for money. You would want to remember that every single funder has its own culture of grant making. You approach them in a certain way. Yes, a lot of it is unspoken, but read everything you can on that funder's website, and then talk to people who have experience with that funder. And that's the way that you understand the funder best, so that you make the right moves and do all the socially acceptable things as you approach the funder. You would want to make sure after you review all grantmaker guidance, you would think about how to repeat back to the funder those keywords, buzzwords, key elements to emphasize, to repeat back to the funder what they want, because you can better believe that reviewers on the review panel will have a checklist, and they're going to be saying, did this person mention this particular keyword or buzzword? Did this person mention this concept? Did this person align with the funder's vision as a reviewer, as a representative of what the funder wants done in the world? So a typical application package looks like this. There are forms to fill out. In many cases at large institutions, you have someone to help you with that, because people know that it's not your normal daily job to fill out forms. It is unfortunately theirs, so be kind to them. Then you'll typically have an abstract or a summary. I'll come back to that in a moment. You'll have a narrative, the story of your project vision, all the peacock feathers up, all the information there, all the beautiful technicolor, all of that. Then you'll have a budget and a narrative description of the budgetary elements, because this is a project. You're asking for money to do things. And as a result, you'll need to make sure that you construe it and present it as a project, complete with that budget, asking for money to do things. Then you'll have documents describing your qualifications and your resources, such as bio sketches, the facilities and resources documents that you include with NSF or NIH, etc. You might have documents describing your collaboration plans or your agreements, such as letters of collaboration or memoranda of understanding. Then you might have attachments or appendices, provided only if the funder wants them. You don't want to give them too much, because they may stop reading after page 15. And they may tell you so very bluntly in the solicitation. But to go back to the abstract or summary, that is quite often a public document. And well, it appears in the funder database, or perhaps in a government-wide database if you're talking about a government funder. So, well, you're going to have to describe your project vision in a very compressed, very condensed way in the abstract or summary, plus give what the funder wants in that abstract or summary, so that there could be an appropriate description in its award database. Then you would want to develop a checklist based on these application elements. And here's a typical checklist, just by bullet point, for NSF research in undergraduate institutions, RUI. You'll have realized by now that our government loves acronyms, so I'll try to spell them out as we go. Research in undergraduate institutions. And so you'll see that there's a whole set of different proposal elements that you'll need to either complete or fill out or upload, or in other ways prepare and submit as part of the application or as part of the proposal. Then you would want to create a timeline by which you will actually produce these elements. Notice that there's a column called responsibility in the middle here. Much of that is going to be you, if you're the principal investigator or the co-investigator. Much of that is going to be you. And the date is the date by when it needs to be completed. Remember that your sponsor programs and research office, who is going to be submitting this proposal on your behalf, remember that they have an obligation to make sure that every proposal going out from the university is appropriate and aligned with the solicitation requirements. So they will need time for the internal routing and approval. They don't just slap a cover page on it, stamp it, and send it out the door. They actually look at it. They are not, by the way, a barrier. They are a group of people who help you. And so there should be a handshake there as well, just saying. So you see the submit final documents at least 3 days before deadline and deliver near final draft to the grants office 2 weeks before the deadline. These deadlines vary at different institutions. Find out what is appropriate at UT Dallas and make sure you adhere, because again, the system only works when you help it work. And yes, it is a system. Grants is a business. You would also next want to create a narrative outline or a template or a skeleton. You would want to format it appropriately. You would want to take note of page or character limits. So for instance, an NSF proposal will likely be 1 of 15, 2 of 15, 3 of 15, etc. An NIH proposal will likely be 1 of 6, 2 of 6, 3 of 6, or 1 of 12, 2 of 12, 3 of 12. You may or may not use those at the bottom, those pagination markings at the bottom of every single page, but it may be useful for you to remember where you are as you're doing a draft. You would want to make sure that you include the required elements in the required order. Remember that the reviewers will have a checklist. They'll be looking for headings. They'll be looking for sections and subsections. They'll be looking for items within those sections, and they'll be looking for the quality of those items that you bring forward in those subsections. You'll want to make sure that you have strategic placement of the content, including, as some people do, boldface or italics or underlining to provide emphasis. Remembering, though, as a caveat, that if you emphasize everything, then nothing is emphasized. So you have to be careful that you're emphasizing and not merely just highlighting everything. And then you'll need to make sure that that the review criteria are in some way represented in your proposal, even if they're unstated. In some funders' requirements for their solicitations, you actually have to address each and every review criterion, as in the U.S. Department of Education, as in the NSF broader impacts criterion. There has to be a separate section headlined broader impacts. But others, those are merely headings or titles of elements. And then sometimes with different solicitations, you even have a reviewer checklist that can help you check off, have I completed all the required elements? Have I put them in the correct order? And have I formatted them correctly so that now I have a narrative outline? Remember that reviewers will have 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 proposals to read. You will want to be easy to read. You will want to be exciting to read. You will want your work to be a standout because it is so good. Remember, when you're writing, remember to check the formatting requirements. Remember to structure your proposal around the funder's required elements. We've already talked about this. Remember to use headings and subheadings to make all elements easy to find. We've talked about that as well. And we've also talked about the fact that reviewers are, in fact, working with a checklist, that they have many proposals to read, and that your task is to make their task easy and even fun, pleasurable. Your proposal should be fun to read. Yes, I'm not kidding. Your proposal should be fun to read. But as you see in the bottom here, that the structure should be predictable or conventional. So think of it like poetry, like a very formal item of poetry, like a sonnet, 14 lines, da-dum, 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 you know, all of that. It's a very rigid structure, but within that structure, you can have significant creativity. So think about involving your creativity in the way in which you express items within that rigid structure. Don't rearrange the structure, because then the reviewers might not be able to find out where the items are on their checklist. You need to be clear, because I believe only the NIH, among all the federal grant-making agencies, only the NIH has what's called standing study sections. Everybody else, I believe, has ad hoc study sections or review panels, which means that those people are gathered together as review panelists specifically for that particular competition, which means that it's all based on who has the expertise and who does not have a conflict of interest with your proposal, which may mean that there are going to be people on your review panel at NSF, at USDA, at the NEH, at the NEA. There may be people on your review panel who are fairly far away from your specific slice or your specific splinter of your field. So you have to remember that, and you have to explain, in many cases, more than you would expect. So be ready to think about that. Be ready to explain the concepts. Be ready to explain the acronyms. Be ready to describe the manner in which your theoretical framework underpins your research approach. Remember also, second sub-bullet, if your proposal is funded, the narrative will be referenced in the terms and conditions of the award as the approved plan of work. So automatically it becomes your plan. Therefore, obviously, it benefits you to be as detailed as possible within your proposal narrative, so that you won't have to think 6 to 9 months down the road, what in the world was I thinking? What in the world was I planning when I said this? Well, if you have it all right there, there's your plan. You've got the green light to go ahead. You don't have to rethink anything. Make sure that you explain step by step what the project will achieve, what you'll do, and then what you'll achieve by doing those activities. And then think about writing with journalistic detail. Journalists use these questions as a mnemonic in order to help them understand that they have actually checked off in their minds. I've described everything about the situation. Who did it? What happened? When did it happen? Where did it happen? How did it happen? And why did it happen? So think about writing with journalistic detail. And if you use that as a guiding structure in terms of coming up with ideas, that can help you to defeat the fear of the blank page or the blank screen, so that you can get started with your ideas. You can also bounce ideas off of trusted colleagues, including colleagues on your team who are helping with the writing. And if you recall, Zoom and Teams have a record function, and if you have the right kind of agreement with them, the subscription with them, you actually have an automated transcript, which means that yes, you can record and you can copy and paste from the transcript, and boom, you have information right there. Sentences and paragraphs of information. So Bob Porter, who was at the University of Virginia when he wrote this article, Why Academics Have a Hard Time Writing Good Grant Proposals, Bob Porter has a famous article that says, here are some differences between, well, famous in my field, the field of grant writers, what the differences are between most other academic writing and grant writing. So some key differences. Second row down. Most other academic writing, like writing for publication, is going to be past-oriented, work that has been done. This is what we found in this past project. Grant writing, however, looks to the future, work that should be done, can be done, will be done by my team, if only you give me some money. Remember, not the hands like this, the handshake. The fourth line down, the fourth row down, most other academic writing explains to the reader, but grant writing actually is focused most on selling the concept to the reader. The difference in tone is in published work is typically, or publishable work is typically objective or dispassionate, or people try to appear that way. And yet in grant writing, it's all about excitement and enthusiasm. And then the final aspect is the specialized terminology. You're going to have a lot of insider jargon for your published article because you know who's going to read it, only specialists. But for grant writing, you don't know all of the people who are going to read it, and some of them might not be specialists, so it needs to be accessible, needs to be easily understood. And typically, I tell people the tone and style of a grant proposal is just a half step more formal than the way in which you present this same idea to your peers at a scholarly conference. Just a half step more formal. So grant writing presents a project plan. Start and end dates, goals and objectives, activities, anticipated outcomes, project management, and dissemination plans, a budget, all of that. It presents it as a plan. It often presents alternatives to mitigate risk, as NIH typically expects. If plan A doesn't work, here's our plan B. And yes, you can go ahead and say that. It shows a return on the funding agency's investment. This is what you will receive. Here are the deliverables, the reports, the prototypes, the models, the software that you will receive if you fund this project. And it can be read and understood by lay people or people with less expertise in your specific area of the field. Typically, It also provides visuals. We're a very visual people, especially since the invention of the TV. We're a very visual people, and the computer, the personal computer, has only accelerated that. So we like visuals, and we like to include visuals representing either the flow of activities in the or the sequence of activities in the plan, or the methodological process by which those activities will be accomplished, and or the overall framework, the theoretical framework of the ideas, how all the ideas connect together. So it's a plan. Needs to be presented as a plan. Can't be presented as an article because it's a plan. It's a plan to do something in the future. So we recommend, we grant writers, we recommend that you seek feedback as early as possible from mentors, from colleagues, from other peers, from program officers, from consultants. Let me note that under program officers up at the top right, the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, is the only, I repeat, the only grant-making agency in the entire federal government that will invite you to send a draft proposal to them weeks ahead of the deadline for their feedback. They are the only grant-making agency in the federal government that does this. They have the dates right there, and if you meet those deadlines, then you will get excellent feedback from the program officers. Because remember, they're looking for the best of the best of the best in order to invest in. So remember that NEH actually provides that opportunity. Other agencies, the program officers will take a look at your concept paper or your abstract, your bio sketch. They might have a phone call with you. Yeah, sure. NEH is the only one that will actually invite you to submit a draft proposal. Notice second main bullet down, be specific about what you want and when, and explain why you asked that person specifically to give feedback. For some people, you have to tell them, I don't care about a missing comma, or I don't worry about apostrophes here. If I have misspelled something, don't worry about it. I'm looking for the ideas, how the ideas all fit together and how they are structured. Are they structured appropriately? And early on, that's what you want. You want to know whether the ideas are rich enough and whether they are full enough. Do you need more ideas here or here or here? Do you need them placed in a different structure, in a different pattern, and a different logic, or different sequence? That's the kind of question you need to ask early on. Only later do you need to ask the question of what does it look like in terms of the formatting, whether it meets standard American edited English, whether it meets those standards, etc. So yes, when you want that feedback is possibly in the concept stage, so that you can get some ideas bounced off of you, and then perhaps when you have a first draft, and then perhaps when you have a near final draft, and go ahead and ask for honest, objective, straightforward feedback. By the way, you'll be getting these slides, so you'll be able to see what I did not talk about explicitly as I went through them. So if you're concerned of the fact that I am not reading off the screen, don't worry. You'll get the slides, and you'll also get a recording, and as a result, you'll get a nice combination of what I wanted to emphasize on the slide, plus what was also there that I didn't really feel I needed to emphasize because you can read. So to make the most of feedback, you remember that, again, it's not all about you. Your intent does not matter if the reviewer thinks it means something else. So if something might lead to misinterpretations or misunderstandings, reword it or take it out. You want to make sure that you beware of the person who steers you towards something more aligned with his or her work. That's a manipulative move. Carefully consider the scientific merit of the critiques, and if you need to, modify your description or your approach to address flaws. of course, if multiple people say that there's a problem here, then pay attention. And the more people who say there's a problem here, that's probably an indicator that you need to do something about it. And then you may have the opportunity to have some reviewers actually read it twice to see whether you've addressed what they came up with as their critiques. But it's your proposal, so be sure you're happy with it and be sure that it expresses your idea. But at the same time, remember that that people are constructively critiquing your work and they want you to succeed. And so take their criticisms in that light. Typical grant narrative elements include intro, statement of the problem, lit review, significance, rationale, conceptual framework, blah, blah, blah. You can see this on the page. However, sometimes these are labeled differently or they are combined. For example, the statement of the problem, the lit review, significance, and rationale might be called background and rationale. The conceptual framework might be called a theory of action. Then it might be called a logic model. A conceptual framework might be called a logic model. It might be called something else. There were famously NSF required people to have a 3D conceptual framework showing how the different planes and the different axes all interacted for one of their most important multi-million-dollar type projects years ago. Famously, they required that. So you had to, yes, represent on a two-dimensional page a three-dimensional figure and explain it, which was interesting. The up at the top right here, the methodology and strategy and the scope of work, they are different. Methodology are the methods used to do the activities. The scope of work are the activities themselves, but many people still conflate that into a work plan or methodology and work plan or something like that. And then, of course, management plan and staff and institutional qualifications are sometimes combined. This person will do X on our project because they have this expertise, like that. But each solicitation will require information to be presented in specific ways according to the culture and the conventions of that particular funder. So the intro, I'm going to be racing through these because you'll be able to read them. But the intro will spark the reader's interest. It'll pull the reviewer in. It'll excite them, and all of a sudden they'll be off like a thoroughbred at the racetrack, and they'll be all excited, and they'll be wanting to understand your entire peacock feathers, your entire picture, your entire project vision in one sitting. So remember that they may well be reading at speed, which means that they'll need really, really good signposts, because when we're driving on the interstate, we have really, really good signposts so that we know the turns that we're going to make or the intersections that are coming up. So think about that. Think about signposting via your language, your headings, the way in which you place things on the page. Do not provide unnecessary background information. In the dawn of time, there was a big bang, and every single thing since that I've got to describe to you. No. Do not also make unsubstantiated claims about your project's impact. It's the next best thing since sliced bread. No. Make realistic claims. This project, the results of this project will add value to blah, blah, blah kind of investigations, which have been increasingly critical as blah, blah, blah leading edge of the field has advanced in recent years. Okay, like that, not next best thing since sliced bread. Statement of the problem, you would concisely describe the problem, you would show why it's important, you would show the gap, and you would use data or information from the literature to explain what the problem is, the gap in knowledge in your field. Do not say what they said in the solicitation to you about the problem, because they know it's a problem. That's why they've got a funding opportunity out there for you to respond to. They know. So don't repeat the same problem back to them. Instead say, here's my solution because my view of the problem is this, and here's the gap that I wish to fill in order to address the problem, the overall problem that is the reason why the solicitation is there. The literature review, which is not always called a literature review, sometimes it's part of the background and rationale. You would want to make sure to show that you understand your field. You would want to review what has been done to address the problem so far, and don't fail to address conflicting work. There are going to be people in your field who disagree with you vehemently. Be professional and say, these people have said this. However, I feel that for these reasons, we should be going in this different direction to investigate a possible solution. The conceptual framework, logic model, theory of action, that will identify the theories or concepts that undergird and guide your project. You would connect the theories or the concepts to the work itself, and you would want to make sure that you bridge the gap between theory and the practice. So you're basically saying, I think I know the best way to approach this problem, and here's why. And I'm using these theoretical ideas or frameworks or an adaptation of them, and explain why you've adapted it in those ways. You'd want to explain all of that in your proposal briefly, of course, because that's all the room you have. The aims or objectives or research questions, some of these will guide you to the stated problem, to solving the stated problem. And NIH will ask you to write a specific aims page, but NSF or Department of Energy or Department of Defense will ask you to provide objectives. Other agencies, energy, education, others may ask you to provide research questions that guide your investigation. You would want to make sure that you can in fact show how these guiding questions or these guiding aims or these guiding objectives will in fact help you to solve or partly solve the stated problem, or fill or partly fill the identified gaps in the literature. Methodology, we've said before, are the methods by which you will do the investigation. Don't assume the reader knows what you're talking about. Explain the methods, explain why you chose the methods, and you would want to include the details for your procedures, your work, your implementation protocols, all of those kinds of things. You will want to include the details so that, yes, when it's funded, that you can just pick it up, press the green light, and go, and use it as your work plan. The scope of work are the activities that you will perform using those methods. So a lot of the time, methodology and scope of work is, as I said before, conflated into a methods and work plan or something like that. Or sometimes people just say methodology, and they mean that as methodology and scope of work. But you would want to make sure that you included all activities necessary, as you see here on the screen, for completing the project, and that you provide a viable schedule for carrying out the tasks. Don't forget sufficient detail, but also don't go overboard. A warning, people at the beginning of the careers, they see a horizon, a 30 or 40-year horizon out in front of them, and they want to make it there in one jump. That's typical of people who are early in their careers. Refuse and resist that urge. Instead, think about how you will take incremental steps along a sequence that's part of that trajectory that gets you there in 30 to 40 years. Think about it that way, rather than, I see a horizon, I want to be there tomorrow. Because you can't go to the moon by going to a used car dealer and putting caulking around the Ford Focus windows and say, I'm going to fill it with air and see how long I live on the trip to the moon. And by the way, it only costs $25,000. You can't do that. People will know that that is not viable. Let's just put it that way. That is not viable, and you will not be viable after you try that. So Do not try that at home. And let me tell you, when you think about the scope of work, the activities you will do, let me tell you, you have to think about practicality. Can you do all this work while at the same time doing all of your teaching, all of your advising, all of your committee work, all of your mentoring of students, all of your supervising of students in your lab? Can you do all of this work that you have proposed? That's one of the questions that you may ask for feedback on when you give this proposal draft to a mentor. Think about that. Is this viable? Can I do all this work in this time frame with the funding that I've requested? Methodology, here's a work plan table showing objectives, activities, and outcomes and products. You would want to make sure that each objective is supported by at least one set of activities and vice versa, and that you have anticipated outcomes or products coming from that, etc. Management plan, who will do the project, who is in the chain of command, who reports to whom, how everything will be coordinated, and yes, please include an organization chart where appropriate. What happens when people disagree on the team? Whose will be the final word? Typically it's the PI, but it may be the PI and 2 or 3 co-investigators as well. So make sure that you address the potentially challenging elements of the planned work, who will do it, and make sure that that you assure the reviewer that you and your team will in fact be able to get the work done, again, within the time frame and within the budgetary limitations of the proposal that you're submitting. And here's another table showing who on the left does what, and on the right, why this person is able to do this kind of work. They have these areas of expertise, these capabilities, etc. Evaluation plan is almost metacognitive. And by that, I mean that on one level, you're going to be thinking about, have I accomplished my objectives? On another level, you're going to be asking, is my project overall successful or effective? And that's a different kind of question and has a different series of ways of thinking about it. You would want to include formative and summative evaluation plans for a very small project, a one PI-led project. It may be that you will need to be objective enough in order to evaluate your own project. With a small team, you may have an advisory board that fulfills that function. With a much larger team, you may actually have to hire an outside external evaluator, or you may have to hire a team, a company, in order to do data collection, do analysis, ask the right questions, and get the kinds of answers that actually show objectively that your project, in formative terms, is or is not on track. And of course, how to get it back on track if it's not. And then in summative terms, looking back retrospectively at the 1 year mark or at the end of the entire project, the question of, would I do this particular approach again, or would I make some changes? And if so, what would those changes be? You would want to make sure that you use the data, the results, the findings from the evaluation to improve the project or to improve similar projects in the future. And here's a sample project evaluation plan table. Performance measures, data source and timing, responsible staff, who's going to do the work, and the data analysis method. Project budget shows how you're going to spend the dollars. Remember, this is a project. This is not just a flight of fancy or a hypothetical thing that you're sending out. You're actually going to, if you're awarded, you're actually going to get dollars, or you're going to spend and you're going to get reimbursed, depending. So if you don't know how to do a budget, don't be embarrassed. Household budgets are very different from grant budgets. So go and find assistance, but make sure that you have everything covered. If you are talking about a group of children who are going to go to a planetarium on Tuesday, you're going to have to think about how they're going to get there. Are they going to need a school bus, a bus driver? Are they going to need the gasoline for the school bus, the bus driver's salary or time or wage? Are you going to need insurance for the children to be able to drive that bus, to ride that bus, to go to that planetarium? So you're going to need to think about those kinds of things. Sometimes people think of it as activity-based costing, which is all about how much it costs to do a particular activity within your scope of work. And quite often Department of Defense contracts ask for that activity-based costing. But I've had great success with something that my pre-award administrator, when I supervised her, Ms. Carolyn Neal, who was with me at Winston-Salem State, she used the idea of a day in the life of my project. It's Tuesday at 10 a.m. What do you see? Do you see people in white lab coats inviting people to come in and participate in focus groups? Okay, what does that cost? The facility, the people, the incentives for the focus group participants, etc. What does that cost, etc. So what do you see in your mind's eye when you think about your project, and how do you make sure that you cover all of the funding to support those activities? The narrative explains the budget, justifies it in that sense, but also describes your calculations. So please show a clear method of calculation for each item. Please make sure you link each item back to grant activities, grant maker goals, and please use the same terminology that you used in the project narrative so reviewers can see, oh, yes, this is what you're spending that money on to do this. And you need to be very, very clear about that. Of course, with the federal government, there are budget categories. So people and their fringe benefits, their salaries, wages, and fringe benefits fit into one category. Travel fits into another. Consultants fit into yet another. Equipment fits into yet another, etc. Supplies fit into yet another. So sometimes you'll be thinking, this is madness. I'm about to tear my hair out. Why am I being asked to put these things into categories? Well, that's the way the business is run. That's how it's done. So you just have to conform to the conventional way that things are presented. And if you need help, then people will help you who are in the Office of Sponsored Programs and Research, or who are in a departmental or college research administration office, who are assigned to assist you. So here's an example of a vague and a more specific, therefore better, description of an item. And you can see the difference in the level of detail. Finally, when you have created the entire package as a whole, you need to ask yourself, is it internally consistent? Does it follow all the guidelines? Will a reviewer be able to find what they need? And most importantly, will a reviewer who doesn't know you, doesn't know your institution, doesn't know your work, will that person need any additional information to understand your project? If the answer is yes, unfortunately, you'll need to think about adding that information to your proposal. You'll need to double check to make sure the package is complete. You'll need to do routing and approval within your institution, and you'll want to submit the package well before the submission deadline if possible, so that if there's any problem with the internet, these things happen. If there's any problem with the internet, that you can resubmit and provide something that is higher quality, or that at the very least conforms to the guidelines, when unfortunately something happened before in the previous version of the submission and it did not. Yes, these things still happen. NIH says, go into ERA Commons, review your proposal, make sure that it looks like you intended it to look. Because after a certain point, we will review it as is. Finally, here at the end of this long presentation, make sure you leverage your resources for proposal development. These are all live links. And yes, NORDA, which I'm a member of, has a resources page and a Writing a Grant 101 page. The Foundation Center, if you do any work with foundations or in traditional philanthropy, there's an introduction to proposal writing. The NSF PAPPG is indispensable, absolutely. That's their Bible, their grants manual. There are 2 logic models sites here that are excellent resources for describing your concept, your project concept, and how all the ideas fit together. Also, for program evaluation, here are several items for program evaluation. Let me note here at the very, very bottom of the page, there's actually a database of member evaluators. You go to that website, American Evaluation Association, www.eval.org, and you click on Find an Evaluator. You can find one who is geographically close to you, or you can find one who is in your discipline or in your topic area. And so if you don't have knowledge of an evaluator from people at your institution, then you can find it here on the American Evaluation Association website. And now I'm going to turn it over for a brief moment, this slide and the next, for Chris to talk about other resources available through Hanover.
Thanks, Paul. So before moving into the Q&A, we just wanted to highlight some resources that are available to all faculty at UTD through its partnership with Hanover. So on this first slide, we have our Grants Learning Center, which is an on-demand training resource we launched in 2021. The resource provides self-paced interactive modules for faculty to learn about and develop proposals for specific competitions. So we currently have modules developed for NSF Career as well as for the NIHR mechanisms. On the next slide, we have resources related to our grants newsletters. So these are our weekly and monthly publications that are focused on upcoming grant opportunities, both in the research and programmatic spaces for healthcare and higher education. And then at the bottom, we have grants calendars that we put out on a bi-monthly basis. And these are focused on more sort of targeted disciplines and topics. So the link on the bottom left, you can sign up for any and all of these. With the calendars, you can sign up for all of the topics or specific topics that apply to your research areas. So with that, happy to move on to any remaining questions.
Thanks, Chris. And just wanted to remind you all that these links will be live in the slides that you receive. So Q&A.
At this time, there are no questions. Thank you, Paul.
All right. Thank you so much.
And thank you and Chris both for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise. Audience, thank you for joining us as well. Stay abreast of upcoming Office of Research and Innovation programs by following us on social media and subscribing to our newsletter. To view Office of Research and Innovation's upcoming events, please visit research.utdallas.edu. This information and the polite request to complete a brief survey about today's program can be found in the chat. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.